Hi, everyone. This is Pastor John, and we welcome you to week number 12 of Amazing Wisdom, Amazing Women. This week, we're going to look at Rahab. Now, we've put these two women together, Esther and Rahab. It's kind of an unlikely pairing, except it will make some sense a little bit later on. I mean, after all, Esther was a queen, and Rahab is a prostitute. They lived some 700 years apart, but each one was responsible for saving the people of God from destruction, and both risked their own lives, in that process. And maybe that's a reason why they're connected. Now, as we mentioned, Rahab was probably in the Hebrew Rechav, but the local Semitic pronunciation of that area probably had it closer to Rahab. The word means he enlarges or he widens. And in the Hebrew culture, God was always about the business of widening things. So, for example, in pregnancy, God would enlarge the woman's childbearing area. Or, like, for example, when coating a grain, the grain would be coated with a thicker coat because as it would enlarge, it would keep it from bursting before the harvest. Sometimes this word to enlarge or to widen was used when it meant giving land to the people. The text is clear that her main income was from her work as a prostitute, but she also owns this inn, which may have, quite honestly, helped out her business. Now, she lived in a place called Jericho, and you can see from the map that I've included where Jericho is. Jericho was the most famous of the walled cities, but certainly not the only one. Towns in this area is known as the hill country. Towns in this area were usually built on the top of a hill so that anyone attempting to overthrow would face an uphill battle. And that's literally where that expression came from. Now, if the town was more in a plain area rather than being up on the top of the hill, they would usually fortify the town with a wall so that enemies would be restricted or prohibited from coming into the town except through one of the main gates, which could be easily closed. Now, there's an interesting part about Rahab. In the Matthew birth narrative about Jesus, she's only one of 5 women mentioned in that birth narrative. And we'll talk about the other 4 a little bit later on. Let's begin by setting the stage for the involvement of Rahab in the biblical story. From Joshua 1, 2 through 6, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I'm about to give to them, to the Israelites. Of course, he's talking to Joshua at this point. I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the deserts to Lebanon, and from the great river, the Euphrates, to the Hittite country, to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. No one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give to them. So it's very clear that the gift that God gives to these people is this land. Now, scholars have tried to map out exactly where that land is located. And in taking the largest area, it actually goes into part of the area of Egypt and then cuts through the deserts of Saudi Arabia and all the way into the area that we now call Iraq, but is near the Tigris and Euphrates River. Many scholars believe that the Garden of Eden was located near the intersection of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And then, of course, the line goes all the way up to the northern part of the Mediterranean Sea. Now, in reality, when the Hebrew people went into this promised land, they only occupied a small, long sliver of this land. There were some tribal locations in the outer perimeters, but for the most part, the population was located along this long sliver. Now, if you look at the drawing that I have on the right-hand side, we show the wilderness journey. And as they go down to Mount Sinai, where, of course, they're given the 10 Commandments, they head back up and they make kind of a loop, and then they eventually work their way up and they cross over the Jordan River. And the first place that they come to is this place called Jericho. Joshua is in charge of the Hebrew people. He comes to this place known as Jericho. They immediately see that it's a walled city, and they're trying to figure out how they're going to penetrate this walled city. So Joshua sends out some spies. He sends out a company of people to pretend like they're just travelers, and they go inside the walled city so they can look around and kind of size up what's going on inside the walls. So let's read now what it says in Joshua 2:2-3. The king of Jericho was told, "Look, some of the Israelites have come here tonight to spy out the land." So the king of Jericho sent this message to Rahab: "Bring out the men who came to you and entered your house, because they have come to spy out the whole land." So, as I mentioned to you before, the text suggests that Rahab has a house, an inn, where she brings people in. Perhaps part of that was to practice her trade. But apparently the king gets notice that she's welcomed in these visitors who were from Israel and that they're really there as spies. So the king commands her to point out those spies or to release those spies so that they can be captured and then can be dealt with. At that point, Rahab has a decision to make. So let's read what happens in Joshua 2:9-11. And said to them, "I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you." So this is Rahab talking to the spies. "We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did in Sihon and Og, the two kings of the Amorites, east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is a God in heaven above and on earth below." This is an important dialogue for Rahab. You know, she's part of the culture there in Jericho. She's not of Hebrew birth. So she probably worships one of the Semitic gods of those days. It possibly could have been Baal or Asheroth, or it could have been some local god that they had created. But there's something about her hearing the stories of how God has blessed the Hebrew people in their journey into the Promised Land, that she comes to the conclusion that this must truly be the true God. And so she shares that information with these spies. When she finishes talking to them, they hatch a plan. And the plan is for them to be hidden while they're looking for the spies. And then she lets them out of the window that she has on her inn, which is a window that's in the outer wall. And then, as the spies left, they were then going to go get Joshua and the army. They were going to come and attack Jericho. But the spies, as part of this plan, tell Rahab to put a red rope or string or some sort of red cloth out of her window. When they attack the city of Jericho, the army will see that red thing hanging in her window, and they will know that that's the house of Rahab, who helped the spies and who honors the God that brought them into the Promised Land. James reflects a little bit on this Rahab story. In the same way, was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction. As the body without spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. James is one of those difficult to understand epistle letters because he brings in this whole notion of faith and works. And there's been a huge misinterpretation about this. Some religions feel that faith is one thing, but in order to make that faith worth something, you have to do works. You have to live out your life as a Christian. Others say that that's tied directly into salvation. And if you don't do the work, then you obviously don't have the faith. While others say it's that faith that causes you, your heart, to do the work. Well, James is using Rahab, of all people, as an example of this idea of faith and work. And what most scholars that I follow tend to say that you have faith first, and then because God is now in your life and the Spirit is in your life, that will cause you to do good things. And Rahab is a perfect example of that. She's heard about this God of the Hebrew people, but when she's confronted with the actual Hebrew spies, she then shares with them, yeah, I've heard about this God and it's changed my heart, and I want to start doing things to support this God. So she does those things by hiding the spies and then letting the spies leave under the cover of darkness so they won't be captured. I also mentioned that Rahab was one of the only 5 women that are mentioned in the Matthean story of the birth of Jesus. And here's what it says in Matthew 1, verse 5 in the New International Version. Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, Obed, the father of Jesse. And then, of course, we know that Jesse was the father of David. And so as a result of that, then David becomes the king of Israel, and it's through that lineage of David that Jesus comes as the Messiah. So in this particular passage, both Rahab and Ruth are mentioned. The 4 women are Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba, but not by her name. She's identified as the wife of the soldier that David had killed, rather than by her name. And then, of course, at the end of the Matthean lineage, he, of course, mentions Mary, the mother of Jesus. Well, as we've been doing with all of the women that we've taken a look at, we look at the wisdom, and in this case, we look at the wisdom of Rahab. There's a lot of focus on her profession. Today, we associate prostitution as a social evil, and of course, in many places, it is still considered illegal. But in those days, it was viewed as a profession, much like any other profession, though there was a lot of whispering. It was still recognized as a profession. So it's mentioned that she's a prostitute. So in other words, she's giving her body for money. But that was, considered one of the professions. Although in the homes and small conversations, those particular women were pointed out that, yeah, they sell their bodies in order to get money coming in. She's confronted with the king and the king's men, and she has to make a decision. And this is a critical decision because if she found out that she was lying, it would certainly mean her death. And she's lying then to protect foreigners who really have a different religion that they're worshiping. It's not the religion that she's used to in her own community. So something must have changed her in the messages that she heard about God bringing the people into the promised land. Based on what she had heard about the miracles surrounding the journey of the Hebrew people, she believes their God is the one true God. Thus, she's willing to trust that God and go out on a limb, even if it would mean her own demise. But God hears her. God sees her faith in action, and God saves her and her family. And according again to the text, they are basically the only ones who are saved when Jericho is destroyed. And then eventually she'll meet someone named Solomon. Now, there's not much known in the biblical text about him, but she will marry him and give an offspring that makes her part of the lineage of Jesus. So, in thinking about both Esther and Rahab, we talked about the holiday called Purim, which is celebrated around as a main holiday within the Hebrew culture, and it's celebrated around the brave thing that Esther did. Well, in a way, Rahab did the same thing, but there's no holiday in the Jewish calendar. What are your thoughts about that? Should Rahab get as much attention as Esther? Of course, remember, Esther was of Jewish descent, even though she may not have been a practicing Jew when she lived in the country, but she was Jewish nonetheless. Rahab is not. And so maybe that's a reason why there's no holiday there. But apart from that, they both put their lives in jeopardy to save the Hebrew people. Well, what do you think about that? Should there be a holiday? Both women had to somewhat lie in order to get what they needed. Now, lying happens in the Old Testament, and in fact, it's considered very appropriate when it proves to further God's plan. Another example of lying were the midwives who were lying to Pharaoh. Remember, Pharaoh was trying to keep the Hebrew people from having so many children. And when a Hebrew was particularly supposed to have, when the midwives are supposed to help a Hebrew woman give birth, they were supposed to then kill that baby in childbirth. But the midwives would say, oh, those Hebrew women, they're so strong and so quick that they have the babies even before we get there. So the baby's already completely born. We can't use the excuse that it died in childbirth. So that's another lie. Well, of course, both Esther and Rahab use lies to get where they want. Of course, Esther's lying is before she's keeping quiet that she's Jewish. And Rahab's lying is in the present tense of having the spies. But I guess the question is, do you think lying holds that same truth today? Is it possible that Christians can tell lies if it's felt that it's part of God's plan or the furtherance of God in the kingdom? Be interested to hear what you have to say about that, but think about that. Think about Esther and Rahab, and their lying was justifiable given the situation, but is that same lying something that Christians can do in the right situations? And then question number 3, had either Esther or Rahab not put their lives at risk, and particularly in the case of Esther, not said anything about her heritage, and in the case of Rahab, turned those spies in, how would that have impacted the history of the Hebrew people and eventually the history of Christianity? Or do you think if these two women had not been faithful, would God have gone a different route? And then what would have happened to those women had they not been faithful? Now we're going to leave all of the women of the Old Testament, and as we get close to the end of this series, we're going to take a look at some of the women in the New Testament. We're going to look at the sister team of Mary and Martha. Remember, they had the brother named Lazarus. So next week, we're going to look at Mary of Bethany, and then the week after that, we'll look at Martha, her sister, and we'll talk about the two differences in the women, but how they both, through their wisdom, contributed to the biblical story, and especially the story around Jesus. Thank you all so much for joining us this week for this Bible study. Have a blessed week, and we'll see you next week.